We are going to be hearing first up from Jason, who is going to be discussing education for the economics of ecological sustainability. So I'm going to get you to take it away, Jason. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, but afterwards we are going to have a conversation that you can just turn your mics on and ask questions as well. And I'm really looking forward to getting engaged with this topic. Thanks, Jason.
Great, thanks for that introduction, Katie. Rockwell country, so I just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this country, both past and present. And part of my project is about protecting country, and I'll start by talking about that. Oh, sorry, one more thing I should say before I get going is I've only just begun my PhD, and I'm only doing it part-time, so I'm probably not nearly as far along as many of you, but this is what I've got. So this is the basic model that I've created to show how the economy mediates the relationship between schools, or what I call education over here, and the environment on the right, which I've represented as a goal called ecological sustainability. And the two parts of the economy that I'm focusing on are employment and growth. And the project has really evolved from right to left. When I first contacted my supervisor, all I really had was this conflict over here between the two rightmost boxes, the way that economic growth conflicts with what I've called ecological sustainability. And then as we tried to draw in education more explicitly, this other aspect of the economy, employment, just seemed to evolve quite naturally. So I'll just step you through quickly from left to right how these four boxes relate to one another. So I would argue that the primary economic purpose of school or education is preparation for employment, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And employment itself has two relationships to economic growth. It's provided by growth, but also importantly, and this is maybe the most contentious part of the model, or what my project is about, is that employment concentrates economic decision-making power about the size of the economy and about really most aspects of the economy. And one way to really understand how these all fit together, what has driven this model, is what's in blue and shown on the screen right now. The theoretical framework for my project is called social ecology, which is, I guess, now quite a big field, but one of the pioneers in the field is a guy named Murray Bookchin. And the core idea, at least in his take on social ecology, is really simple. And that's that humans' domination over nature is caused by humans' domination over one another. And so if we really want to solve our environmental problems, we should really look at our social problems. And these two boxes on the right over here are really about how humans dominate nature, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And these two on the left over here, education, and insofar as it prepares for employment, are really about how humans dominate one another, and I'll spend more time talking about that. But first, about these two on the right. Okay, the key to understand how economic growth conflicts with ecological sustainability is really to understand that the economy is a real thing, or at least it has a real component that what the economists call just the real economy, that requires real matter and energy for the production of real goods and services. And so this brown box, which represents the economy, as you look from left to right, as the economy grows, it gets bigger, and it grows into the surrounding environment or into the containing ecosystem. And this could be on a local scale or a global scale. It could be the earth as a whole. And so, as I said, because the economy is a real thing, it needs more and more matter and energy. And from this perspective, it's clear that the economy cannot grow forever. But the other really important part to understand about this is these two arrows, the brown and green arrows at the bottom here. So the brown arrow, they're both pointing to what's called welfare over here, and that really means human welfare. This is an anthropocentric model. So the brown arrow is the contribution that the economy makes to human welfare. That's what we call economic services. And the environment or the ecosystems also contribute to human welfare, but by what's called ecosystem services. That's represented by the green arrow. And ecosystem services are broadly defined as things that ecosystems do that benefit people. So climate stability, pollination, biodiversity levels, an ozone layer, all sorts of things. Thousands of things that ecosystems do that we benefit from. And the key to understand how these two things are in conflict, the growth of the economy and the environment, is that as the economy grows, so as we look from left to right, this brown arrow is getting thicker. So we're getting more and more economic services, but it's doing so at the expense of ecosystem services. So the green arrow is getting thinner. And so that's what that indicates is things like climate change, biodiversity loss, a hole in the ozone layer, plastics in the ocean, and 1,000 other things where these ecosystem services are being degraded. So that's, if I just go back, that's the way in which humans dominate nature. I should say too that economic growth is not a sideshow. Every country that I've looked at has as a core part of its economic policy growth. That's what the name of the game is, so to speak. And clearly it can't go on forever. Okay, so but according to the premise of social ecology, if we want to resolve this problem, we should really look at the sources of hierarchy and domination amongst humans. This is a graph. This is a graph that I prepared from the World Bank Development Index, in which the rates of employment, which are graphed on the y-axis, vary with the rates of completion of high school. So basically, the more education that people get, the more likely it is, or the higher fraction of countries' workforces are engaging in employment, which I'm treating, I think, properly as a synonym for wage labor. And I've graphed this for two sets of countries. The green ones over here, which I've called minority countries, or what the World Bank calls the developed countries. We have Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Japan, all those really rich countries, the countries with the biggest. And the other data set is for the brown dots here, what I've called the majority countries, or what the World Bank calls the least developed countries. And then I've overlaid this whole thing with this big arrow here and called that economic growth. Now, I should say that it may not be really entirely correct to ascribe a causal relationship here. It may not be really correct to say that as economic growth proceeds, it causes people to go to school later, and that causes people to engage more in wage labor. It's probably the case that it seems that for many of these majority countries, or what the World Bank calls least developed countries, they have very what they call a very informal economy. So many of them could be engaging in what we would consider wage labor, but it's just not picked up in official statistics. People who are working on a farm or for a family business, and they're not actually getting wages. But in any case, one thing we can confidently say is that for the richest countries in the world and those with the biggest economies, the vast majority of people who are working in those countries are engaging in wage labor or employment. Okay. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I think this is probably intuitive for a lot of people, as I mentioned at the beginning, but I thought I would just throw out one example here to show that indeed a key goal of education, and as I said, I would argue the primary economic goal of education is employment. So so long as Australia has formed a national educational policy, it has always included at least one goal to prepare students for employment. And here's one here from the Hobart Declaration. To respond to the current emerging economic needs of the nation, and to provide those skills which will allow students maximum flexibility and adaptability in their future employment. And this is quite typical. As I said, this is always the case so long as Australia has formed national educational policy. And this is not just true in Australia either. It's true when I looked in Canada, the United States, the UK, New Zealand, probably most places in the world, it's commonplace. Okay, so what's the problem with that? What is an employee? So an employee is, I've taken this definition somewhat ironically from the Australian Government For Work Ombudsman, and they define an employee as one who, quote, performs work under the direction and control of their employer on an ongoing basis. And I think this is quite revealing of the essence of what wage labor or employment is about. It's essentially about working for somebody else and doing what you're told. And this is, if you look back, Marxist historians have always considered employment as basically an evolved form of master-slave relationships. And there's no doubt that employees nowadays, especially in rich countries, have made enormous material gains and have many more choices, let's say, mostly through consumption, than people, slaves in Roman times or serfs during the Middle Ages. But it nevertheless is basically a form of domination that people have to essentially rent themselves to somebody else on the labor market and just do as they're told. Okay, so what my research questions are about are just these three simple ones so far. So the first two is, I just want to know what do young people understand about, and what are their attitudes toward these two key aspects of the economy that I mentioned? What is their understanding and attitudes toward employment and towards growth? And then as a second stage of the data collection, I would really like to know how young people respond to the conflicts surrounding those four boxes that I showed at the beginning there. What do they know about and think about, or how do they respond to these relationships between education, employment, economic growth, and ecological sustainability? I should also mention, I have still got a couple of minutes, that I'm just starting to read as part of my literature review. There's quite a rich and I think quite fascinating history of libertarian schools, or I guess what are sometimes called democratic schools, that provide a vision for what an very alternative purpose of education could be, and rather than preparing people for working under the control and direction of other people, of preparing them to work under their own control and direction, and where necessary to work together, work with one another, rather than working for one another. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So that's what I've got so far, and it looks like I've still got a minute and a half. I think, and those are my references. So I think maybe I'll just cut it off there and see if anybody's got any questions, comments, critical feedback. And thanks for listening, everybody.
Oh, that was fantastic, Jason. Great job. If you don't mind, before we go on to the questions, can you unshare your screen so that we can see each other a little better?
Absolutely.
That was an excellent presentation. We only had a few little technical lags there, but I think that we heard it all anyway.
Good.
I'd like to open it up to questions. I've got a few here, but I'd love to open it up to questions if people wanted to turn their camera on and unmute themselves and give me a wave or just start talking. Let's see if we can get a question from the floor. Not yet.
It was a bit too much information. Maybe people are still digesting it a little bit.
That's no problem. I've got one that's been messaged to me.
Okay.
I'll read it out for you. So how would you approach economic sustainability through a political angle? Do you think the current political regimes world over need to give substantial prominence to economic sustainability? I would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Okay, well, a few things I should say about that is I don't think it makes much sense to I don't think it makes much sense to talk about economic sustainability without talking about environmental sustainability. I mean, the environment is really the container, and that ought to be the thing, I think, that we sustain because it is what provides the basis for societies and economies and so on. So that's really, I think, should be where the focus of sustainability is. And oftentimes people use the word sustainability without any preceding adjective, and it's really vague, like what it means. So when the questioner asked about how to sustain the economy, I would suggest first that we really focus on sustaining the environment. And one thing I didn't say, but and a little bit more explicitly about how to do that, is it possible for me to share my screen again just for a minute? Okay. So one way to do that, oops, sorry, is if you look at this, the diagram that I showed in the second slide, this one here. So the counterpart, or what I have found is the best counterpart to the growth economy, is what's called the steady state economy. And the steady state economy is essentially attempting to keep steady or only mildly fluctuating the amount of matter and energy flowing through the economy in order to sustain a steady or mildly fluctuating human population and stock of human artifacts. If anyone's interested in that, they can just follow the source down there, Herman Daly, or send me a message, I can send it to you. And there, to help understand that even, or simplify that, the matter and energy together flowing through the economy are collectively called the throughput. And the size of the economy is measured by the GDP, or gross domestic product. And there's not a one-to-one relationship between GDP and throughput, but there is a direct correlation. And there's no time for me to go into it right now, but there is a direct correlation between the two. So to go back to the speaker's question, if we want to have a sustainable economy, the first thing we need to do is to stop growing the economy. Now, as for the political angle, how she asked, or he or she asked about the what political angle we might take. Yeah, I mean, as I said, the more I think about this, I really think that that it needs to come from the ground up. It needs to be a bottom-up, a popular revolution, let's say, where people collectively agree that we're not going to try to solve all our problems through economic growth anymore, and we're going to try and keep it in a steady state. There are all kinds of policy prescriptions that ecological economists have made for arriving at a steady state economy, but I think without any popular understanding or popular push, I don't think we can rely on our political leadership to do it. But I don't know, maybe I'm just cynical.
Are there any other questions? I can't see any written down. If someone wanted to unmute.
Yeah, hi. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, so I was wondering, like, have you considered, like, if social TSR, if it's made compulsory? Social
TSR?
Yeah.
What is it?
um, it's corporate social responsibility reporting, corporate social responsibility, like because I was studying contemporary issues in accounting, so we had this we touched a little bit of the sustainability and economical, social, and environmental. So there was one point that we've discussed, like maybe if we make so CSR reporting, corporate social responsibility compulsory, that it might contribute to better, you know,
Yeah, I understand. I understand what you're talking about. I thought you said TSR. Yeah, CSR, corporate social responsibility.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my own view is I don't hold out great hopes for this, to be honest. I mean, there is an alternative framework for corporations to operate in, which is called benefit corporations. And in order to get benefit corporation status, anyone who wants to be certified as a benefit corporation, they do have to achieve a certain level on this benefit corporation scale, but it's entirely voluntary. They don't have to do it. And for those corporations that are not benefit corporations, and most are not, I think the problem is it's actually an institutional problem. I mean, over time, I'm not an expert on this, but from talking to corporate lawyers and doing a little bit of research myself, basically a CEO has been obliged by law in order to operate in the interest of their shareholders. That's what the courts have interpreted their duties over time. And the courts have interpreted that duty over time as maximizing the profits of the corporation. So it's not, I mean, even if they remove that CEO and they put in somebody else, the institutional framework is still the same. So yeah, I mean, personally, I don't hold out any great hope for CSR like you suggested. I mean, if some corporations will follow this, or for those that will say, for example, get benefit corporation status, that's great. But most of them don't. Actually, I should say, I think one of the big ones to get it and to voluntarily get this was Puma, which I think Tobias is a German company. They had this idea that they wanted to uphold these social responsibilities and environmental responsibilities. But I think the evidence strongly suggests that it's not really a priority for them.
Yeah.
That's my own take anyway.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, because now it's up to the company to choose whether they will follow this reporting or not. But yeah, my thoughts were like, if let's say the state the country makes it compulsory for all of the companies that make certain profits that they should do CSR. So maybe they will have to do something in order to have something to report. Maybe I was thinking in that way, but okay.
Then the question is it's true, but then again, maybe I'm just a little bit pessimistic, or maybe I would say I'm just realistic. But then you would think like, okay, well, what corporations will do then is they'll, spend large sums of money to get people into parliaments who will pass legislation in their favor and so on. And that's why I don't know, maybe it's just because I am doing this in the School of Education. I want to hold out hopes for the possibilities for social change that can come from the ground up and through education. But I really think rather than waiting for leadership and top-down panaceas, it really has to come from the ground up, which is why I'm doing the project that I'm doing. But I hope you're right. I mean, I really do. I hope that can happen. That would be fantastic if it can.
Yes.
It'd be great to see a bottom and top meeting in the middle, wouldn't it?
Well, I should say too, yeah, also, I don't see why we have to focus on just one or the other. I think both are important and can play important roles.
We've got 10 more minutes before our next session starts, so I'm going to put it open for one more question. Does anyone feel free to pop your mic on? Mahi, did you have a question to ask? This is very much your area. You're on mute, that's all.
You're on mute, Mahi. You can't unmute.
I think it's just on the left-hand side, just like normal to unmute. While we wait to see if
I've got her the question from Yao down here.
Yeah, let's go for that one, and I'll see if I can find Mahi's question.
So if I just read it, what about developed countries trying to grow economically? Are you suggesting they stop growing and engage in sustainable means? For developed countries, like rich countries, yes, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. And also, another thing I should mention, I'm glad you asked this question, is that growth and development are not the same thing. And I'd really like to invite everyone to join me in using these words distinctly, because very often growth and development are treated as synonyms. But again, if you think back to that diagram that I showed, growth is really a quantitative increase in throughput. So it's the actual expansion of the economy means that there's more matter and energy that needs to go to providing that growth. Development, on the other hand, is any changes in economic production with the throughput held steady. So once we hold those levels of matter and energy steady, development is any changes that occur with that held steady. And the best way to think about this is just think about the analogy of a human body. Like, I have a almost four-year-old daughter, and she's grown so much in the last 4 years. I mean, she started out like that big, and now she's like, that big. But if you think about an adult body, what happens is eventually we stop growing. That we, after we go through puberty and all that stuff, we reach a mature age. But that doesn't mean that we stop developing. We continue to develop without any growth at all through experience and education. And the economy is the same thing. Once we get to a certain level, I would argue strongly that we need to stop growth. We need to stop increasing the amount of this, what I call the throughput, this matter and energy flowing through the economy. And we can still then have development. So we can still have technological development. We can still have changes in fashion. We can still have changes in income and wealth distribution, information. All of these things can still develop and change with growth held steady, or with the size of the economy held steady. So to answer your question, sorry. You said developing. I kind of thought that, you said developing now. So for developed countries, yes, I am saying that. And for developing countries, yes. Also, I think that there are, for many of those countries that I showed in the bottom left-hand corner of the graph, they really do need to grow. Who should we be in a rich country or developed country to say that those countries ought not to grow? I think they quite justifiably want to raise their standards of material well-being, and that needs to happen through growth. So for developed countries, think about it like this. The developed countries are like, I guess it sounds so patronizing, but they are like adult bodies, and any economic changes should come without growth. And for many developing countries, sure, they should. Of course, they need to grow.
Jason, we've got Mahi's question down the bottom here, which is, have you thought of the way you will engage with your participants to generate change through your research? Yeah. Now, we've got maybe 1 minute for that, 1 or 2 minutes for that answer.
Okay, so super quickly. You know, as part of my honors research, my honors research was on student activism. So I was always thinking about, yeah, how can we actually get young people to actually act on some of this stuff rather than just talking about it. So I would really ideally like to get them to generate change. But I think for the purposes right now of the project, that might be a little bit too advanced, or I just want to keep it really simple. I would be happy if it came from them to help to facilitate things that they can do to generate change. But that at this point, Mahi, it's not part of my research question. Maybe it will evolve that way. And to answer super quickly, like in 15 seconds, Tobias's question, regenerative agriculture instead of sustainability. Yeah, I don't really, to be honest, I don't really know that much about it. One of my share mates, he lives in the same property as me. He's doing regenerative agriculture, but I don't know enough about it, to be honest, to comment on it. And sustainability really just means what I said, a steady or mildly fluctuating throughput, supporting a steady or mildly fluctuating human population and stock of human-made things. That's how I'm defining sustainability.
Tobias, we have like 1 or 2 minutes if you wanted to put your mic on to talk to that question. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I mean,
in those two.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, not necessarily regenerative agriculture. I mean, the idea certainly comes from there, and particularly from Charles Messie's work. But just as a conceptual idea instead of sustainability, like I'm always myself was a big fan of sustainable solutions, but now I'm more tempted to go in the direction of regenerative work rather than sustainability, because it implies a bit of a stagnant, how do you say it? Yeah, it's more stagnant. It's not as flexible, as adaptable as to regenerate something is allow us that sort of development instead of the growth in particular. And just thinking of a concept, I mean, it's probably yeah, too much for you to look into at this stage. If you're already sold on the sustainability, it's a big rabbit hole to disappear into. So, but yeah, just a bit of food for thought.
You're muted, Katie.
Yeah, that was for you, Jason.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mahi's just written in here, she's unable to get her microphone unmuted. I'm trying to click on her name to get it to happen. Can you try now, Mahi? I think I've unmuted you. Nope. She has said also looking at the donut economics from Kate Rathworth will explain more about regenerative by design system rather than growth. I think it'd be great to get Mahi and you in contact. And all of you, there's so many synergies between your research. So maybe we can look at that in the future. Thank you again, Jason. I'm glad we got to have a little bit of a discussion.